Okay, here's our goal. We have a city council with representatives from districts 1 through 8, as well as the mayor, and they need to come to consensus on the priority of a large backlog of legislative items that will ultimately be voted on and potentially become law. But before they're ready for an up or down vote, these items require careful study and review of their cost implications, potential timelines, and so forth, so that officials can refine them into specific, actionable proposals and make an informed vote. Reweighted range voting, or RRV, is a process for prioritizing these issues in a way that's both democratic and fair. It begins with a 0 to 5 score. For instance, the representative from D1, whom we'll simply refer to as D1, has scored apple a 5 and spinach a 0. Similar to a review of a business on Yelp or a product on Amazon, these scores provide a simple and intuitive way to express high-fidelity information as to the representative's prioritization of these important policies. To understand why RRV works the way it does, though, let's start by imagining we were to naively use the raw score totals. To keep things politically neutral, we're going to prioritize fruits and vegetables rather than hot-button political issues. But to mimic complex political realities, I've divided the council up into two broad camps: the fruit faction, highlighted orange, and the veggie faction, highlighted green. We see that despite holding only a narrow 5-4 majority, the fruit faction dominates, getting all three of their favorite items prioritized ahead of any of the veggie items. While this might reflect the consensus that fruits are all just a bit more important than the veggies, it violates our notions of fairness. So how should we solve that? Now, a naive alternative proposal might be to do a simple round robin, where we loop through the list and call on each council member to choose the next item to prioritize. But this leads to a free rider problem. For instance, apple is the top item for D1, D2, D4, and D5. They all give apple a 5 score. But if D1 prioritizes apple, the other three members can simply jump straight to their next choice without incurring any cost. That creates a perverse incentive for D1. If they're confident that someone else will choose and prioritize apple, then they might try to pick their second choice, banana, so as to get both their first and second choice prioritized high on the list. A good process shouldn't reward or incentivize gamesmanship, but instead should reward honesty. Ideally, we want to prioritize apple, but we want all 4 apple advocates to share the cost of prioritizing it. And indeed, we want D3 to share some of that cost because they believe it's a 4, if not a full 5. So this is where the magic of RRV comes in. I'm going to go ahead and put a 1 here next to apple to show that it is the highest ranked item and it will go first in our priority queue. So you see this red arrow here, which is saying that apple is the highest priority that has not yet been pulled into the queue. So here's my 1. And all of a sudden, these numbers shift and the order changes. And rather than banana being next in the list, broccoli is next. So we're going to come down here and give broccoli a 2. And then you're going to see it comes back to banana as the third item. And I'm going to put in a 4 next to the arrow for spinach. And we're just kind of going back and forth here, going through the list, and it's kind of interleaving, creating that sense of fairness that the fruit camp gets something and then the veggie camp gets something, and it goes back and forth. Now that seems great, but how does it work? Like, what's actually happening here? Well, there's a weighting which reflects your current level of power in the process based on how much power you've already exercised. It starts out as a 1. That just means you have 100% of your starting weight. Nobody has prioritized anything yet, therefore nobody has spent any of their power, so to speak. Now you have this weighting formula. It's 1 divided by 1 plus W over 5. This is pretty simple, but let's explain what we mean here. W is the number of points that any given voter, any district representative or mayor, has given to everything that's been prioritized thus far. So you see here that D1 gave a 5 to apple. So when we rank apple number 1, this weight of a full 100% vote, or effectively 2 out of 2, becomes 1 out of 2. It gets cut in half. And that makes perfect sense because W now is 5. The total points they've given to everything prioritized is this 5. 5 out of 5 is 1, which essentially means you've used one full vote of power. And then you add 1 to that, and then you want to divide it. You want to say 1 over that number because you're not trying to multiply and get more power the more you exercise. You're trying to get less. So that's why it's inverted and you have this reciprocal of 1 over that amount. Now, you can see here what would happen is that if the next item prioritized, you had also given it a 5, then this 1/2 would become 1/3, and then it would become 1/4, and then 1/5, and so on. So it's a really simple geometric progression. It's just a half, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, etc., however long your list is. But that's also proportional, so the math can get interesting here. Like, for instance, here we see 5 over 9. That's not a whole number fraction like 1/2 or 1/3. That makes perfect sense, right? Because this 4 is a little bit less than a full ballot weight, right? It's less than 5. If it were 5, that would just be 4.5 over 9, which is the same as 1/2, so it's just 1/2. But because it's a 4, it boils down to the fraction 5 over 9, which is just a little bit more than 1/2, which makes sense because D3 used a little bit less than a full vote of supporting Apple, right? So it's proportional, and you have to do that because, look, if you gave no influence to Apple, no support for Apple, well, then your weight shouldn't be changed at all. You should still have 100% of the weight that you had in the first round. And like if it's a 5, then it should be half as much. So you have to keep that proportional and divide it so that wherever it falls in that range, it's in proportion to that. Like if it were a 1, then you'd get 5/6, which is just a little bit less than a full 1 of 6/6. And likewise, if this were a 2, then this would have been 5/7. If it's a 3, 5/8, 4, 5/9, 5, 1/2, and so forth, right? So the math is actually really simple, but it has to preserve that idea that if you're somewhere in between a 0 or a 5, then the weighting has to be in proportion to that score that you gave, so to speak, okay? So that's basically the mathematical underpinnings. And so what you can see it's doing here is it's really trying to balance that sort of fairness that you'd get like in a round robin process, but also with that consensus, right? You want everyone to share in sort of putting their influence together to add up to whatever it takes to get something prioritized, and not just making like the first person to prioritize something have to cover the full cost of it and then lose some of their influence because they sort of took that hit. We're all sharing in this together, so your faction should collectively own the things that you prioritized. But you're going to see something really interesting here, right? If this list were to get really long, like in the real world, say you have 50, 60, 70, however many items that you're prioritizing, if a camp does have a small majority here, like in this case 5-4, occasionally it won't go back and forth, right? Like occasionally there will be times when 2 fruits will be prioritized in order before a veggie gets prioritized because there is a slight majority favoring the fruit camp, and so they should occasionally get to prioritize 2 things to only 1 thing prioritized by the minority faction. And indeed, if there were one outlier, like one council member who had a bunch of items that really only mattered to them, they gave those items a 5, everybody else gave them a 0, then roughly 1 out of every 9 items going into the queue would come from that outlier. And that makes perfect sense, right? If you are a total outlier and you're your own little faction and you're one of 9 voting members, then about 1 out of 9 of the items that gets prioritized should be your pet item. Right? So you can fall anywhere you want to in between being a total outlier if you are very divergent from how other people score things, to if you're more in the consensus view and your scores are similar to those of the other voting members, then you're going to collectively take that hit together, right? And I think reweighted range voting does a really good balance of getting both that consensus and that fairness, but also being relatively simple. Like, this is not rocket science. You're just doing a little addition and division, and it can all be administered nicely in this spreadsheet. And from the point of view of someone voting, it's just dead simple. It's just a score of 0 to 5. We don't want to put you through these complicated, hoops where you have to say, take a list of 50 items and literally give each one a unique ordering, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on up to 50. So 0 to 5 is enough fidelity, it's enough nuance without making it too much and making it complicated. It has to be usable by humans, right, at the end of the day. So I hope that explains the basic theoretical underpinnings of reweighted range voting, how it can be both fairly simple and both really powerful, and both fair and consensus seeking at the same time. And I hope you've enjoyed that, and thanks for watching.